You spoke about, Ms. Hilton, I know that you spoke about masks and that they don't breach human rights. However, I haven't heard much about the human rights that are being breached. And if we look at the Victorian Human Rights Charter, Section 12 says that every person lawfully within Victoria has the right to move freely within Victoria. Section 16 says every person has the right to peaceful assembly, has the right to freedom of association. Section 21 says every person has the right to liberty and security. A person must not be subjected to arbitrary arrest or detention. In the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23 states that everyone has the right to work. Do you accept that the government is currently breaching these human rights?
I accept that the government is limiting those human rights. But those rights under the Charter are not absolute, and they are subject to Section 7, which is a limitation or justifications clause. So the point about whether or not the limitations are necessary, proportionate and justified is the one that I made earlier. And really to determine whether or not there has been a breach of Charter rights, that's the analysis that you have to go through.
Okay,
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so if we talk about that, all right, so I think you said necessary, justifiable, proportionate and time-bound. So we're in a situation where the time boundary is expanding dramatically, 3 times longer than the initial legislation allowed for. Necessary, I don't know, that's a matter of opinion. Like you said before that it requires evidence, but we've heard from the CHO himself that many of the decisions that they've been making have not been relying on scientific evidence. They've been relying on the precautionary principle where there isn't evidence required. It's just, on the balance of things, and we saw this with aggregate activity demand, and also justifiable. I've been asking about this. The government in my mind, needs to justify the harms that they're causing, that the benefits that they're getting from these actions are outweighing the harms. We haven't seen any calculations of what these harms are causing, and therefore I don't think it's possible to say that it's justifiable. What's your response to that?
Well, I think that I take your point that the limitation and the limitation of some rights, and certainly the measures under lockdown 4, they are having consequences for many different members of the community, and that those consequences are in some cases severe. I don't dispute that there is a very, very legitimate aim and purpose to the restrictions of these rights at the moment. And I think that the analysis and the justification which we have been highlighting is what is required to understand, in a rapidly evolving situation at any given point in time, what is the most proportionate response. And in that respect, I think it's why we're lucky that we do have a Charter of Rights and Responsibilities here in Victoria, because it does allow us to have that framework and that lens to do what you're suggesting, which is to balance up, well, what's our right to freedom of movement against the right to life, for example. And so that is a very difficult and balancing exercise. And it does involve information, public health information, and also a consideration of exactly how proportionate the restrictions are. And thirdly, what we heard again and again in the consultations is the critical need for education and the diminishing value in public education about religious faith here in Australia. And so that is a critical recommendation of ours, that the Commonwealth and Victorian governments should each develop religious engagement and public education programs about religion and the place of it in Australia, very much led by a human rights lens or framework, and that education program should be going to the children. It should be in schools. It should be part of police and security services.
Hi everyone, and happy Cultural Diversity Week. At a time when so many of our world elected leaders are using their platforms to send messages of division, it's really important that as a community we stand up for equality, for belonging and for respect. That we celebrate the diversity and the richness that being part of a multicultural society delivers to all of our lives. And that's why at the Commission we are delighted to be a sponsor of Cultural Diversity Week. The week was kicked off in spectacular fashion at the Premier's Gala dinner on Saturday night, hosted by Helen Kapelos and the Victorian Multicultural Commissioners. In the words of the Premier, we don't just tolerate diversity, we celebrate it. And it was really a beautiful and generous display of the many unique cultures that make this state really great.
Sam Dastiari was relaxing at a student bar about to present a talk on his new book. And then this.
You terrorist, you little monkey.
Bro, you hook us up some beers, mate?
His attackers belong to the far-right group Patriot Blue. They were quick to ridicule the New South Wales Senator's heritage.
Why don't you go back to Iran, you terrorist?
By now, the uncomfortable backbencher had had enough.
I think you guys are a bunch of racists. I don't have time for you. Pale
What
But the harassment continued.
Look at these terrorists, mate. Why don't you go back to Iran?
Sam's federal colleague Tim Watts leapt to his defence.
What race is Islam?
What race is Islam? I just want to ask the question. Okay, sorry. What race is a
Dastiari's attacker Neil Erickson has form. In September, he was convicted for a mock beheading over a proposed mosque. He could be in trouble again.
And those people can be prosecuted by Victoria Police, they can be fined up to $5,000 and they can be imprisoned. Regardless of your background, where you're from, what you believe or who you love, every Victorian deserves to live a life free from hate. But we know that for many people that's not always the case. 18 years ago, Victoria introduced the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act to protect people from vilification. Vilification can include things like trolling, online abuse, physical threats, violence, and severe ridicule. But this law is complex and it's narrow and it's not equipped to deal with the world we find ourselves in today. A world where more hate and harm is spread through online and social media than ever before. The Victorian Parliament is looking at the effectiveness of anti-vilification laws, and we're recommending that the laws be expanded to protect LGBTIQ people, women, and people with disabilities, as well as the current protections offered to people with religious beliefs and from different racial backgrounds. We're also recommending changes to the way in which we determine whether vilification has occurred, looking at the harm that's impacted individuals and their communities, rather than focusing on a complex and difficult to prove incitement test, which doesn't really capture the type of hate that people experience. What is critically important is that the law reflects community expectations. What's also important is that we get the balance right between freedom of expression and protecting people from hate and discrimination. We also know that a law like this is only effective when it can be properly enforced. We've recommended that the criminal law be simplified to deal with incidences of hate. We've also recommended that the Commission's powers for resolving disputes and looking into systemic issues of vilification are strengthened. And we also know that the public need to understand better about what protections are out there. What does vilification look like? How can you prevent it? How can you respond to it? We live in one of the most diverse communities, and it's important that everyone in that community can live their lives without hate and free from vilification.